Hey everyone, and welcome. Let me ask you a question. What do you really, truly believe in? It's a huge question, right? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dive into the big ideas that shape our world, our communities, and even our own identities. We are talking about ideology. So here's our game plan. First, we'll start with what you believe. Then we'll get into this big idea of individualism versus collectivism. We'll look at what shapes your beliefs, check out a real-world case study on liberalism, see how ideas exist on a spectrum, and finally, wrap up with your key takeaways. All right, let's jump right in. Have you ever had that feeling that you're searching for something to believe in? You're trying to figure out your place in the world and where you stand on all the big issues. And, you're not alone in that feeling. The punk band The Ramones captured it perfectly with this line. That feeling of looking for something, of not even knowing where to start, that's actually the perfect jumping off point for our conversation today. Okay, so when we talk about something to believe in, what we're often talking about is an ideology. Now, what is that? Well, it's not just one opinion. It's a whole system of thought, a framework really, built on your beliefs and values that helps you make sense of the world and how we should all live in it. And every ideology at its core is trying to answer some pretty massive questions. Think about it. What are people really like? Are we naturally good or selfish? And what about society? Is it a good thing? What is our role supposed to be? Seriously, your own answers to these questions are the building blocks of your own personal ideology. Now, here's a really useful way to think about pretty much any ideology out there. You can usually figure out where it stands by placing it on a spectrum between two key concepts, individualism and collectivism. So what's the core difference? Well, it really boils down to one question. What's more important, the group, the we, or the individual, the me? Collectivism says the group's needs and goals come first. Individualism, on the other hand, puts the freedom and value of each person above the group. And let's break that down a little more. On the collectivist side, you see words like cooperation and shared. The group takes care of its members. On the individualist side, it's all about competition and private property. Individuals are responsible for themselves. Now, it's super important to remember, neither of these is right or wrong. They're just different blueprints for how to build a society. So, that brings up a really good question. Where do you land on this spectrum? And maybe even more important, why? Let's take a look at the different puzzle pieces that come together to shape what you believe. I love this image because it's the perfect way to think about it. Your identity isn't just one thing, right? It's like a giant puzzle. And each piece is a different influence, a different experience that has helped shape who you are and what you believe. And what are those puzzle pieces? Well, they're things like your culture, the language you speak, your family's spiritual beliefs, your gender, and of course, the media you consume every single day. All of these things work together to influence where you might land on that spectrum between individualism and collectivism. Okay, so we've got the theory down, but what does all this look like in the real world? Let's make these big ideas more concrete by digging into a case study of a major ideology, liberalism. First up, we have to talk about the original version, which we now call classical liberalism. This idea popped up in Europe a few hundred years ago, and for its time, it was totally revolutionary. Its core focus was the individual. It was all about personal freedom, very limited government, and a free market economy. And this was a massive deal, especially when it came to money. Before this, you had something called mercantilism, where kings and governments controlled pretty much all the business. Classical liberalism flipped that on its head and introduced capitalism, which is all about competition and way less government control. As you can probably guess, those are some pretty classic individualist ideas. But like a lot of big ideas, it wasn't perfect. A totally free market created huge wealth for some, but it also led to pretty terrible poverty and exploitation for others. And that made people start asking a really tough question. If you're working 14-hour days in a dangerous factory just to survive, are you actually free? That one question sparked a huge evolution in how people thought about liberalism. And that evolution is so important to understand because it shows us that ideologies aren't set in stone. They're not static. They change, they adapt, and they evolve as societies run into new problems and start asking new questions. And that brings us to what we call modern liberalism. As you can see, it's a bit different from the classical version. While classical liberalism is all about protecting individual economic freedom, modern liberalism actually argues that the government should step in to help create more equality of opportunity for everybody. You can think of things like public education or healthcare programs. It's a slightly more collectivist approach. So you see, they're both types of liberalism, they just land on different spots on that spectrum. Whew, okay, that was a lot to cover. So let's boil it all down to the most important things you need to remember. So here are your 4 key takeaways. Number 1, an ideology is basically a system of beliefs and values. 2, most of them fall somewhere on that spectrum between individualism and collectivism. 3, your own beliefs are shaped by tons of different factors. And 4, ideologies aren't static. They can and do change over time. All right, let's do a quick knowledge check to make sure all this is making sense. First question, just in your own words, what's the main difference between an individualist and a collectivist perspective? And for our last one, why did modern liberalism develop out of classical liberalism? Really thinking about that one will help you understand not just how this one idea changed, but how entire societies can change over time. Thanks so much for joining me.